You might not think much about soybeans, but they probably impact your life more than you realize. For example, they're the most important component in the supply of the nation's animal feed, feeding things like chickens and dairy cattle and even fish. They're also a significant component of the nation's production of biofuels. But to really show their power in 1963, soybeans nearly brought down the New York City Stock Exchange. If for nothing other than its sheer audacity, the great salad oil swindle of 1963 deserves to be remembered. Soybeans have a surprising history, with a 2004 study of soybean genetic diversity published in the journal Biological Resources and Migration, suggesting the domestication of soybeans began in China as far back as 9,000 years ago. From the beginning, the plant was used primarily as a source of forage for livestock, but also for human consumption. Soybean cultivation in the United States began in the middle 18th century, with possibly the first attempt by a Georgia farmer named Samuel Bowen in 1765. Bowen may have been attempting to use them to produce soy sauce, which was growing in popularity in Europe. The crop was still relatively rare in the U.S. and might have stayed that way were it not for a shipwreck. In 1850, 17 shipwrecked Japanese sailors who had been adrift at sea for 50 days were rescued by the American trading bark Auckland. It turned out to be an important event. One of the sailors, Hikozo Hamada, would become the first naturalized U.S. citizen from Japan, and the interest aroused by these 17 men from the closed Japanese society would partially spur Commodore Perry's 1863 naval expedition, which resulted in the opening of Japan. But the shipwreck had another surprising effect. Among the food stores the sailors had with them were some soybeans, so rare and unknown in the U.S. that they were referred to as Japanese peas. Dr. Benjamin Franklin Edwards, brother of a former governor of Illinois Territory, had gone to San Francisco for the gold rush. He was one of the physicians who examined the Japanese sailors for disease. In exchange, one of the sailors gave Edwards a handful of the Japanese peas. Edwards brought the peas back to Illinois and gave 6 to a prominent merchant in Alton named James Henry Lee. Lee planted those 6, the first soybeans known to have been cultivated in Illinois, in his garden. According to a historical marker in Alton, Mr. Lee would go on to share the results of his crop with various horticultural societies, thus playing a significant role in soybean development across the country. By the 1870s, soybeans had become popular with farmers nationwide as livestock forage. The cultivation of Japanese peas was encouraged by both the Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Patent Office. But the real revolution came courtesy agricultural scientist George Washington Carver. While Carver might be more renowned for his research on peanuts, he was just as important to soybeans. Like peanuts, he found the soybean could be a valuable part of crop rotation, replenishing soil. Like peanuts, Carver was able to discover vast new uses for the crop. In 1904, Carver changed the industry when he discovered a method for extraction of oil from soybeans. The oil could be used for food items such as non-dairy cheese and flour, as well for industrial uses such as paints, plastics, and cosmetics. His work on soybeans brought him into collaboration with Henry Ford, who supported soybean research and cultivated thousands of acres and encouraged farmers. Ford cars made extensive use of plastics made from soybean oil, and by 1935 each Ford car used a bushel of soybeans. According to the Henry Ford Museum, Ford had a suit made from soybean fibers that he modeled for the press. And in 1941, he famously produced a concept car built largely from soybean plastic called the soybean car. Demands of the Great War further drove soybean production, and by the 1940s, the U.S. was a main producer of soybeans. As a result, in 1940, Congress amended the Commodity and Exchange Act of 1936 to include fats and oils. While the purpose was to regulate trading and protect farmers, one result was the creation of a salad oil futures market. Demand and production increased further during and after the Second World War. In 1953, Congress passed Public Law 480, better known as the Food for Peace program. Intended to use American agricultural surpluses to provide food assistance worldwide, subsidies and support then drove a growing export market, leading to an ironic result. The journal Farm Progress notes, by 1955, Japan had become America's largest single customer for soybeans and soybean products. It was quite the victory to come from 6 beans passed to an Illinois doctor a century earlier. By the mid-1950s, the U.S. had become the world's largest producer of soybeans, unwittingly setting the stage for one of the worst commodity scandals in the nation's history. Anthony Tino deAngelis was born to Italian immigrant parents in 1915 in the Bronx. At age 16, he quit school and began working at a meat and fish market. Within 3 years, he'd moved up to managing the store. From there, he became a foreman at a hog processing facility in the Bronx. And from there, he invested in New York butchery. Agricultural journalist Chris Bennett writes in a 2024 edition of the agricultural journal AgWeb, hidden behind physical features, a diminutive 5 foot 5 inches in height and plump as a boarding house cat, hair combed directly back, horn-rimmed glasses, pearl gray neckties, no jewelry or outward flash, ambition's fire roared in deAngelis. In 1948, he formed the deAngelis Packing Company along with his wife, operating a packing plant in North Bergen, New Jersey. And in 1950, acquired controlling interest in the Adolf Goebel Company, a venerable meat packing company started in 1915 by the man dubbed the Sausage King of New York. deAngelis financed the purchase by borrowing $325,000 from the Public National Bank and Trust Company of New York. deAngelis told the New York Times that the purchase was made for investment and with the view of the continued operation of the long-established business. In fact, deAngelis had a specific investment in mind. Architectural historian Suzanne Spellin explained in a 2012 edition of the magazine Brownstoner. He learned about the federal government's National School Lunch Program, which was enacted in 1946. The program was touted as a lunch program to feed hungry children a balanced meal in the nation's schools, but was really a move to shore up farm and produce prices in the post-war years. The feds would pay big bucks for foodstuffs, and many unscrupulous vendors unloaded substandard goods on the government, which paid them anyway. It was a great opportunity to make money, and that was what deAngelis was all about. deAngelis used Goebel to make a large government contract to provide meat for the program. In 1952, the government charged him with overcharging on the contract by $31,000, but that wasn't all. deAngelis also authorized the sale of more than $2 million worth of uninspected meat. Spellin notes, the feds may have been lax, but they weren't comatose. If that meat had been bad, it would have been a disaster of major proportions. The government sued. Immediately, another scandal followed as the Federal Trade Commission alleged that deAngelis overstated company assets to avoid bankruptcy. Trade in the company's stock was suspended, but deAngelis escaped prosecution. Bennett writes, deAngelis skirted responsibility, blamed a mix-up, and agreed to give Uncle Sam $100,000 for the trouble. Blacklisted from government contracts, the Goebel Company went into bankruptcy and was eventually sold to a conglomerate. But deAngelis had already moved on. Bennett notes, the future, as he correctly assessed, was in soy. The key was the Food for Peace program. In his 1966 book, The Great Salad Oil Swindle, Norman Miller explains, the reliance on private companies in this government-subsidized program gave Tino his opportunity. Bennett writes, the supply of soybean oil, generally sourced from the Midwest, was outpacing domestic demand. deAngelis envisioned U.S. food-grade oil flowing to foreign countries, with his fingers on the tap. In 1955, he founded the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation with, Miller writes, only $500,000 in capital and the help of 22 loyal cohorts who had worked together with him at Goebel. Bennett writes, 1,000 miles from the soybean blankets of the Midwest, he bought a tank farm in Bayonne, a battered petroleum storage center with roughly 150 tanks, some 50-plus foot in height, and converted the facility into a soybean and cottonseed oil refinery. As ever, deAngelis had an angle. He would need more capital and then have to compete with large established soybean processors in the Midwest. But, Miller explains, deAngelis understood how to get allies. If the Midwest companies that dominated the edible oils market also moved into the foreign field with their own sales organizations, it would have eliminated a lucrative source of income for the equally big commodities export companies, which are headquartered in New York. Instead, deAngelis planned to buy the soybeans in the Midwest, refine them in his New Jersey plant, and sell them at a small markup to the New York exporting companies. Margins would be small, but he planned to make up his fortune on volume. Miller writes, the export companies jumped to accept the service Tino offered them. They loaned him millions of dollars so he could put his scheme into operation. deAngelis' business plan was risky. He planned to purchase Midwestern soybeans at prices competitors couldn't match. Bennett writes it was a precarious high-wire act. Buy high and sell low. But it worked. deAngelis became the salad oil king of New York, the darling of the Food for Peace program, and a very wealthy man. Miller writes, by the late 1950s, Allied was supplying more than 75% of the edible oils shipped overseas, a business that added up to well over $100 million a year. But there was always an underlying stink of the scam artist. He faced a steady stream of lawsuits and fines for accusations of tax evasion, scamming the Food for Peace program, and shorting deliveries on contracts with foreign governments. Another scandal involved shoddy cans from which oil leaked. He managed to stay, Bennett writes, on the cusp of prosecution. But his biggest play was yet to come, and his plan depended upon the futures market that Congress had created in 1940. Matthew Parker, who holds a PhD in economics, wrote in a 2012 edition of Money Week magazine, deAngelis decided to corner the market for soybean oil, buying up huge amounts of the physical commodity, as well as soybean futures. Investment advisor James Chen explained deAngelis' goal in Investopedia. He hoped to virtually corner the soybean oil market, driving up the price, thus raising the value for both his futures and underlying commodity positions. To finance his plan, he planned to borrow against his company's inventories of oil, and for help he would look to one of the biggest names in finance. American Express was, Miller wrote, famed around the world for its traveler's checks. That fame had led to the creation of a subsidiary, American Express Field Warehousing Corporation. A warehouse receipt is a document issued by a warehouse operator that serves as proof of ownership for goods stored in the warehouse, detailing the items, their quantity, and condition. But a warehouse receipt is only as valuable as the faith that the banks have in the reliability of the receipt. American Express had an advantage in the field of issuing receipts. As Miller explains, no other company enjoys higher respect in the banking community. But it was a risk, given deAngelis' record at Goebel. Still, he managed to convince the president of the field warehousing subsidiary that he was a good risk. He showed him the Bayonne facility, which he described as state-of-the-art. Buoyed by the apparent faith by the exporting houses, and possibly desperate himself as the subsidiary was not performing to expectations, American Express agreed to take Allied on as a customer. The great salad oil swindle, Miller writes, was on. The swindle was based on a simple principle. Oil floats on water. Chen writes, at some point, Allied began to falsify records to attain more loans, claiming far more soybean oil than it maintained in storage. Brian Taylor of Finian, an investment data company, writes, American Express sent out inspectors to make sure that deAngelis had the vegetable oil that acted as collateral. But what they didn't know is that many of the tanks were filled mostly with seawater, with a minimum of oil floating on the top to fool the inspectors, or that some of the tanks were connected with pipes to other tanks so that the oil could be transferred between tanks when the inspectors went from one tank to another. The scam was really massive. Not content to just borrow against water-filled tanks, deAngelis faked the number of tanks. Time magazine reported in 1964, many of the tanks in which the non-existent oil was supposed to be stored didn't exist either. By an intricate system of leasing and subleasing, Allied managed to convince a lot of people that it had stored nearly 1 billion pounds of oil in a tank farm in New Jersey that had a capacity of only 500 million pounds. What's more, deAngelis apparently managed to steal some blank receipts from American Express and simply forged his own. Chen writes, and on the basis of his stunningly large, almost totally fake inventory, deAngelis claimed 1.8 billion pounds of soybean oil, but had only 110 million. Bennett writes, Allied turned Amex-verified warehouse receipts into loans from 51 big-time institutions, including Procter & Gamble, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, and Bank Leumi. In turn, Amex got a cut of each transaction. But Bennett also notes the extremity of the fraud. However, none of the 51 counting houses noticed that deAngelis reported oil holdings exceeding USDA's entire national inventory level. That is, deAngelis had borrowed against more salad oil than apparently existed in the United States. Noreen Malone of New York Magazine noted in 2012, the swindle raised at least $180 million from investors, but the whole scheme depended upon prices rising. Time noted that deAngelis owned so many futures that with every 10-cent shift in price, he stood to gain or lose $12 million. And the bottom fell out. deAngelis had bet heavily on a foreign deal with the USSR after their sunflower crop failed in 1963. Bennett writes, during a 6-week span in autumn 1963, soybean oil prices rose from $9.20 to $10.30 per pound, and deAngelis believed that he was in the clear. But Bennett continues, on November 15th, all hell broke loose at Allied. The U.S. Senate stopped negotiations on wheat exports to the USSR, and the market got nervy with projections that soybean and cottonseed oil were next in line. In 48 hours, soybean oil tumbled to $7.60 per pound, and all eyes were on Allied. Partridge writes, that left Allied crude vegetable oil with huge losses in the futures market, forcing it to declare bankruptcy in November 1963. When the receivers came in to investigate its assets, they discovered the scam. Without the product that was used to secure the loans, Allied filed for bankruptcy on November 19th. The news started to break on November 20th as two firms that had made loans, Ira Hopt and Company and J.R. Williston and Bean Incorporated, had trading suspended at the New York Stock Exchange after Ally was unable to make good on margin calls on the loans. This rocked the market as the suspension of trading meant that the two firms' other investors lost access to their accounts. Time magazine noted the fallout. 16 companies have been bankrupted. 11 firms controlled by deAngelis have gone under, and as have two respected Wall Street brokerage houses and one subsidiary of American Express Company. Embarrassed bankers from London to San Francisco have been taken for many millions. So have deAngelis' customers, notably the Isbrandstein shipping line and such worldwide commodity dealers as Continental Grain Company and the Bunge Company. The complexity of the scandal was stunning. The New York Times described it as like a whodunit, but the scandal would be barely noticed by the public. On November 22nd, President Kennedy was shot. The nation was shocked, and the market tumbled over news that simply dwarfed what Time called the most prodigious swindle in modern times. The federal government charged deAngelis with fraud. Initially, his bail was set at $43 million, which was thought to be the highest bail ever set in America to that point, but it was eventually lowered to $150,000. He pled guilty, was sentenced to 20 years. The biggest loser was American Express. They paid out far more than they were legally required to investors who lost money because it was so important to them to preserve their credibility in their much larger and more important traveler check business. But their stock lost almost 40% of its value. Still, the company survived. A little-known investor scooped up that stock, thinking that the dip was temporary, that the company was undervalued and would be a good bet in the long run. It was a turning point in the career of a then just 34-year-old Warren Buffett. deAngelis was paroled after 7 years. The man who had been described as portly lost 70 pounds in prison and credited prison with saving his life spiritually, physically, and morally. In 1980, he was convicted of fraud again, this time with a pork company and some sort of swindle that has been described as a Ponzi scheme. He was sentenced to 7 years, but paroled in 1983. In 1993, at the age of 77, he was convicted of fraud another time, this time in a swindle involving forged lines of credit. But he was a free man when he passed away in 2009 at the age of 93. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.